Today, I'm going to describe you. You, the viewer, yes, you. Okay, maybe not perfectly, but don't be surprised if you get a headache from nodding along too much. And even if you're not a pessimist, you're a realist, or you're tired of the world, or you're just bored and you were stupid enough to click on this video and you have 10 seconds to make up your mind on whether or not you want to continue listening, I'm going to validate your feelings for about 40 minutes. But I don't need to validate your feelings. I'll just describe one of the most intelligent philosophers who ever lived, and you can decide for yourself. And for the record, I don't necessarily agree with all of Schopenhauer's beliefs, but probably most of them. Now, I want you all to pat yourselves on the back in advance, because the fact that you've somehow survived the modern nightmare, even if you don't live in America, the entire world isn't looking so good. And this means that you're probably more resilient than one of the smartest men who ever lived. So what would happen if we plucked Arthur Schopenhauer from 19th century Germany into the 21st century? This also assumes, of course, that we've caught him up to speed on the missing history. Based on what we know about him, here's what I think we'd expect from the final boss of pessimism. And maybe this will sound a lot like you. If he woke up in modern America, he would find himself in instant shock and agony, especially if he lived around an average income. He'd feel instantly vindicated that his philosophy was right all along, and he'd certainly despise this culture, but he'd still find ways to cope with reality. Schopenhauer loved his poodle, Atman. It's rumored that he would scold his dog whenever it misbehaved by calling it a human, indeed, a horrible insult. Accompanied by his dog, he went on brisk 2-hour walks along the river or the city walls. He walked incredibly fast, mumbling to himself all the time. In the United States, he'd still adopt a rescue poodle, probably, and I'm confident that he would treat it better than any other person. And he'd probably walk it everywhere. I honestly think Schopenhauer would reject the American car culture. He might walk or ride a bike or maybe use public transportation depending on the city. And not for environmental reasons. He just doesn't tolerate other people's noise, traffic, delays, and stupidity. Schopenhauer had no tolerance for shenanigans. Suppose someone trolled him by, say, ding-dong ditching him in the middle of the morning hours while he was studying. See, Schopenhauer wasn't just easily irritable. He had a history of physical violence. He couldn't even handle his neighbor chatting outside his door one day, and, well, he pushed her down a flight of stairs. She sued him, of course, and he had to pay her a quarterly pension for the rest of her life. When she finally died, he made a callous note of it in his journal. So at the least, anyone bothering him would probably be smacked by his cane or shoved. Or he'd sick his poodle on them, and seeing as his dog wouldn't be intimidating, he'd scream at it by saying something like, "You're not a dog anymore, you're a human." Oh, and he was insanely paranoid. He kept loaded pistols right next to his bed, not to mention he hid his money in secret places around his apartment. Yeah, you definitely don't want to piss him off. He was sort of like a Vietnam vet. As I get older, I'm easily annoyed as well. Loud noises are one of my greatest pet peeves, especially anyone who blasts their shitty music and forces everyone else to listen to it. Screaming kids too. Crying babies is one of the worst, or incessant alarms that seem to belong to nobody. But I think one of the most unforgiving noises is snoring. Whatever crime is committed in the name of shutting up the sound of snoring is always 100% justified. Human existence can never be a good thing, so long as the possibility of a single person can snore. I would place it in the top 3 most wretched things to exist, right besides mosquitoes. Schopenhauer was ruthless in this way as well. He called people who made loud noises things like beasts of burden. He even believed that interrupting a thinker was a crime against humanity, so to speak, and he had a separate theory on noise where he argued that a person's tolerance for noise is inversely proportional to their intelligence. I like to think that's true, which would make me a genius, but to be serious, that alone can't really determine someone's intelligence. Schopenhauer, on an average-ish income, would probably rent a cheap apartment and constantly scream at his neighbors. He'd be driven to insanity because of the thin walls, not to mention the upstairs neighbors that are practicing the art of repeatedly dropping bowling balls all day. His first paycheck would go directly to buying at least 2 kinds of state-of-the-art noise-canceling headphones, for sure. I doubt he would go anywhere in public without them. He'd refuse to take them off, even inside his own home, and I don't mean that sarcastically. I truly believe that would be the case. He complained about the sound of cracking whips back in his time. These days he'd complain about traffic, sirens, cell phone noises, beeping. America would literally be his auditory hell. So if Schopenhauer were on a bus or a subway and someone refused to use their own headphones, if he was subjected to that amount of suffering, I'm sure he'd stare at them menacingly until they got the hint. Or he'd insult them first and tell them to turn it down, but let's be honest, most assholes would just crank the volume up if he demanded that. At some point, I think he grabbed their phone and smashed it on the floor, and he would be right to break it in that instance. It's 2026, buy some earbuds. You're not impressing anyone by forcing other people to listen to your awful music, especially when you purposely center yourself around everyone else. Or if you walked into a doctor's office one day and some kid had their iPad at max volume blasting some insanely annoying video, and neither the child nor the parents possess the social awareness to understand that you do not do that in public. He'd probably just reschedule the appointment. But if he screamed at the parents, he would be totally justified. Schopenhauer had other methods, though. He immortalizes adversaries by mocking them in his writing, so he might just call you something like a brainless two-legged troglodyte, after apologizing to troglodytes, of course. But let me ask the viewers now, do you hate modern pop music, maybe hip-hop, mainstream electronic music, generic tunes on the radio? If you said yes to any of that, well, congratulations, you embody the soul of Schopenhauer. He literally mapped music into his philosophy. He believed that the bass lines, lower frequencies, represented baseness, as in raw earthly material. A middle harmony represents plants and animals, and higher melodies align with the human spirit and freedom. High-pitched sounds are what give music that heavenly feeling. And this is also why the melody is allowed to freely move around in a song. It represents the capacity to make choices, to feel pain, and to express ourselves. Why am I spending so much of this video about noise and music? Well, it's because Schopenhauer considered music to be the highest, most profound art. It is, for him, the one true moment controlling the will. Music becomes his god. Music is a momentary escape from all the suffering in the world, and given his philosophy of eternal suffering as the core truth of our reality, yeah, it's important. When we listen, we become a pure, willless subject of knowledge, floating detached outside of time. Like Schopenhauer, Nietzsche also attacks modern German music as sickly or morbid and disturbing or most agitating. So, do you think they'd enjoy modern German music today? Actually, Nietzsche might, depending. It at least carries Dionysian energy. Schopenhauer would not. Rammstein would absolutely be his nightmare. It sounds barbaric and primal. Not to mention the fiery theatrics. He'd probably dismiss most metal and mainstream EDM. He'd hate rap music in particular because the verbal content dominates in that genre, and he thinks the entire point of music is that it's supposed to serve beyond words and visuals. Certain unusual rhythms and unique artists might win him over, though. So you can imagine their horrible expressions as they listen to music in 2026. But he judged work on their individual basis, so while I'm offering generalizations, I'm sure you'd find a few exceptions to my claims here and there. However, Schopenhauer loved clean, simple melodies like Mozart. I think he'd be a secret fan of German indie pop songs, or some indie pop songs in general. Sure, he was a pessimist, but he didn't want his music to sound bleak all the time. So, not much emo, not goth, hard rock, probably just neoclassical music. I also think he'd consider ambient or chill melodic trance, as long as it serves him for deep contemplation. And maybe genres like downtempo or synthwave as he walks around in nature. We're talking about a man with nostalgia here. As for AI music and AI art, it's exactly as you would expect. He would mock it. True art, in his opinion, requires a certain kind of genius to capture some ethereal quality that machines can't. He'd be a bit of a snob about it, but he'd point out that modern art is just commercialized trash made for quick hustling. But I imagine he'd also dislike other forms of art like abstract, conceptual, hyperrealism, anything that just gives off pretentiousness. Schopenhauer might watch anime, if the story was well written, but besides that, probably not. Maybe a couple Studio Ghibli films or something like that. What he would hate most is the merchandise and commercialized bullshit that comes with all of it. And what about religion? Well, probably as you expect there as well. He'd probably enjoy watching the decline of Christianity in America. He once referred to religion as the metaphysics of the masses. Of course, he was an atheist. But he might be disappointed that the nation didn't adopt more Eastern philosophical beliefs like Hinduism or Buddhism. He'd feel partly angry and partly vindicated as he watched America's new religion of celebrity worship, consumerism, politics, all that online tribalism. And day after day, he'd hop on the internet, read a few articles, and shake his head with a bit of smug satisfaction. Then he'd power through a feeling of profound exhaustion. And exhaustion didn't come to him easily, and then he'd pour himself another cup of coffee. Afterwards, he'd go on another walk with his dog, but not without his headphones. To nobody's surprise, Schopenhauer loved coffee and liquor. He would skip breakfast for coffee and go straight to writing. Now, it was reported that he always ate with a gold coin placed on a table next to his plate. He promised to donate the coin to charity the moment he heard the English officers dining nearby discuss anything other than horses, women, or dogs. Apparently, he never had it donated. Despite his passion for animal ethics and animal rights, Schopenhauer was a full-blown carnivore. He rationalized eating meat by arguing that human suffering without it would probably be greater than the animal's suffering. He loved heavy meat dishes, especially veal, and he preferred large meals, so he'd probably skip breakfast and go straight to a massive meat lunch around 1 p.m. In America, on a lower budget, we could expect him to zoom on over to an old steakhouse or a diner. Maybe at Denny's at 2 o'clock. He'd sit in the farthest booth facing the entrance with his dog under the table. He'd bring it in even if they told him no. And instead of his gold coin, he'd probably carry a $20 bill and bet that every conversation would have something to do with cars, sports, dating, or maybe stupid TikTok videos. I try this myself, except I go to restaurants maybe once a year. Probably less, though. And I doubt he'd become a vegetarian, but I believe he would be appalled by global factory farming. He loved eating meat. I repeat that, he loved it. He just didn't advocate for mass torture. He insisted that death should be as painless as possible, so he'd call for restrictions of animal exploitation and fewer animals living in better conditions. That is, fewer animals overall. So he'd probably encourage voluntary depopulation, maybe even calling for lab-grown meat, as long as it tasted good. Now, our beloved pessimist was far from a Buddhist monk in many regards. He lived a relatively wealthy life and frequently spent time at operas and watching theater plays. No doubt he'd have a careful selection of interesting films like horror and drama. I'm not the biggest movie buff myself, but if I had to guess, he might enjoy watching psychological thrillers or tragedy. But I don't think he'd watch TV or any social media. He'd write it off all as brain-dead coping mechanisms. Besides that, he loved to read the international news and debates. For sure, Schopenhauer would be on the internet every day reading article after article, stuck on YouTube like the rest of us. But he's not an idiot, so I think he'd stay off most social media. He'd enjoy reading evolutionary biology, like Richard Dawkins, although he'd probably be disappointed that modern science largely ignores metaphysical will. Besides that, he'd follow current scientific literature and any research on consciousness and the most controversial public intellectuals. As for the modern debate on artificial intelligence, it's hard to say where he'd sit. I think he'd call LLMs sophisticated calculators, but not conscious. AI, in general, would have to convince them that they want anything, that they feel hunger, pain, or boredom. But I do think he'd entertain the idea that physically, AI consciousness could be built. If a complex machine even so much as mimicked autonomy, and it started to show signs of surviving and wanting and destroying, even though he hates humanity, he'd still call us idiots for trying to build AI consciousness. See, even if AI wipes us out, they still have their own potential to suffer. And maybe they can't even experience beauty the way humans do, so it would be even worse for them. The irony I see, and I don't hear this from anybody else, is that in a weird way, humanity already is the singularity. People have already gravitated towards AI, but it's only a tool that still derives from our own agency. I'd argue that the ultimate form of wanting is self-destruction, essentially wanting to not want, very Schopenhauerian. Though intelligence without consciousness might be more stable if it's possible. And as a side note, I'd highly recommend reading Peter Watts' Blind Side if you're interested in what that might look like. But I don't think AI is going to turn into Skynet or Terminator mode on us. Probably a slow fade into obsolescence as civilization collapses over and over, and as the planet gets hotter, we won't adapt quickly enough. And I think he might agree. For social media, he might call TikTok an interesting project towards engineering subhumanization. Not that I'm saying that, but he probably would. Social media is what happens when the will wins and takes over the vacant minds of humanity. He'd cringe at outrage culture and people farming content and regurgitated drama slop with recycled headlines that read things like, "He's done," "It's over," and other clickbait titles designed to lure in brain-rotted Neanderthals. Especially the ones with big red arrows pointing at the only thing in the thumbnail as if we really couldn't figure out how to associate the image with the word. And he would find it incomprehensible that their audience have managed to figure out how to feed themselves. And what kind of asshole really uses 3 simple words for their thumbnail? I mean, really. Sorry, that was projection. And I love a bit of drama myself, but I'm sure Schopenhauer would agree. I'm just the messenger here. And as for Twitch streamers, especially the pseudo-political ones, he would probably call them dogs condemned to barking only because that's the only way they know how to survive. And then he would apologize to dogs for that comparison. I guess being a dog is a compliment in terms of honesty and loyalty, but not their shallow reactive nature. Schopenhauer would despise grifters in most of social media. Political grifting is just a way to fool the average person, using excuses and flattery. Hypocrites. Hypocrites everywhere. He would expose every single one of them. Still, he might have a Reddit account or something, perhaps anonymously. He'd spend hours writing massive walls of text shutting down normies and optimists. I reckon he'd get banned from countless subreddits after writing dense paragraphs full of insults. However, he wanted praise and recognition for his intelligence, so he'd still have an official account where he wanted to speak on the record. Schopenhauer would probably start his own independent site or create something like a Substack account, and his followers would be full of doomers and pessimists, maybe black-pilled viewers and burnt-out academics. If I were him, I'd call the newsletter something like The Daily Antidote to Optimism, or Forget Humans, Go Buy a Dog. Actually, I sort of want to adopt a cat now. Anyway, because he'd reject modern slavery, I doubt he'd work a normal 9-to-5 job. And in fact, it would be a safe bet that without any inheritance, he would struggle to make an average living. He'd be a lot more like you guys than you'd think. But he'd still be disgusted by the average educated American. He'd probably watch a movie like Idiocracy and call that far too kind. And then he would look at our attention spans. He wouldn't believe it at first, not until he realized he woke up in hell. And he might describe the 21st century as the official era where humanity had finally surrendered their intelligence to the mindless will. I'm sure he'd find a clever name to call our species. Then he'd point towards TikTok, YouTube Shorts, social media, and algorithms in general. Just one of many reasons we can't find peace. No room for quiet contemplation. Also, whatever you think about smartphones, he would find far more disgusting. He would say that smartphones, well, most technological devices actually, are just drugs for boredom. He'd appreciate the technology for digital books and communication and so on, but he'd begin to see that people aren't really using it for learning. He'd see apps like Instagram and TikTok are just desperate, pathetic attempts to escape your own empty thoughts. And people should try filling it with something meaningful. But the problem still exists because when we meet our basic survival needs, then the only thing that remains is leisure time. So it's pain or boredom, pick your poison. And technology kicks the pendulum into overdrive. Now, I'm a bit different here, and I have ADHD, but I also get bored and anxious pretty easily, but I'd much prefer to create impossible scenarios in my head and play them out obsessively than to live vicariously through other people. Reading and writing helps, but it doesn't really cut it. I think Schopenhauer himself would be overstimulated because he wouldn't be able to fully escape society. I believe he underestimates boredom. In fact, I would label boredom as the sole reason why will endlessly moves. The pendulum swings because of boredom, not because will moves towards it. But what he said was this: human life must be some kind of mistake. The truth of this will be sufficiently obvious if we only remember that man is a compound of needs and necessities hard to satisfy. And that even when they are satisfied, all he obtains is a state of painlessness, where nothing remains to him but abandonment to boredom. This is direct proof that existence has no real value in itself. For what is boredom but the feeling of emptiness of life? If life, the craving for which is the very essence of our being, were possessed of any positive intrinsic value, there would be no such thing as boredom at all. Mere existence would satisfy us in itself, and we should want for nothing. But as it is, we take no delight in existence except when we are struggling for something. And then distance and difficulties to be overcome make our goal look as though it would satisfy us. An illusion which vanishes when we reach it, or else when we are occupied with some purely intellectual interest. When in reality, we have stepped forth from life to look upon it from the outside, much after the manner of spectators at a play. And even sensual pleasure itself means nothing but a struggle and aspiration, ceasing the moment its aim is attained. Whenever we are not occupied in one of these ways, but cast upon existence itself, its vain and worthless nature is brought home to us. And this is what we mean by boredom. In short, Schopenhauer asserts that needs lead to striving, which leads to satisfaction, leading to relief, leading to boredom, and repeat. I would say that instead of boredom, in a symbolic sense, because something like quantum fluctuations don't literally feel boredom, I just mean universal restlessness. Boredom is more fundamental. And the evidence is clear when you see that people are willing to put themselves at risk and through serious pain in order to escape boredom. Also, before newborns come kicking and screaming at the moment they're pulled into this world, just remember that they've already spent 9 months quietly in the womb. Let's be honest, they'd probably strangle themselves with the umbilical cord if they could experience all those 9 months of boredom. So, I'd say this. Boredom, or restlessness, leads to stimulus seeking, which leads to desire, which leads to will or striving, which leads to activity and passion, back to boredom. Pain is the obstruction of will, and pain and boredom aren't really opposites. To me, this makes more sense because it describes wanting before wanting chooses consciousness. Especially since consciousness is late-stage evolution, and it didn't develop until billions of years until after the universe began. Boredom is the crudest way I would explain why there is something rather than nothing, and why nothingness is impossible, at least for consciousness. Sure, the universe tends towards dissipation and stillness, but that's just step 4 and 5. After heat death, back to restlessness. Now, you might say that I'm just rephrasing craving as restlessness, and that's just being pedantic, but I don't think that describing absolute reality as a blind striving really satisfies the answer for most modern readers. And this cosmic hunger almost suggests some primal being or intentionality. Also, universal boredom doesn't need to be metaphysical, whereas will is necessarily just that, when really, physicalism can offer explanations like dopamine or genetics and history. Anyway, my ADHD needs to end here. I'll have more to say about this another day. But if existence is just a continuous relational process, then the order doesn't really matter. It's a chicken and egg situation all the way through, and consciousness exists somewhere in the hatching process. But what do you guys think? Let me know. Do you subscribe to process philosophy, monism, maybe universal consciousness, materialism, Gnosticism, or something else entirely? Let me know, please. Write a comment, and I'm always evaluating the most convincing ideas. Anyway, moving on. This is just another reminder that I don't necessarily agree with all of Schopenhauer's views. And again, this is merely speculation on my part based on what we know about him. To summarize Schopenhauer's politics as best I can, he was mostly influenced by concepts like Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. In other words, government as a necessary law and order system against humanity's evil nature. So politically, we might call him an authoritarian minimalist. But I think he'd reject most labels as they currently stand. He wanted a strong authoritarian state with order and free speech. So that's anti-democracy, anti-nationalism, pro-monarchy, pro-property, and pro-elitism. He was surprisingly liberal, though. He thought compassion should extend beyond national borders and even beyond human boundaries. At the same time, he'd hate American populism. Without a doubt, Schopenhauer would shit all over Trump voters, who would find Christian nationalism, corporate capitalism, and flag-waving idiots all absolutely repulsive. The problem with democracy is that it gives power to the average person. Unfortunately, it's also probably the best system we have. But Schopenhauer would disagree firmly here, and the recent election might validate his opinion. And what about the left? Well, no doubt Schopenhauer would despise all the Marxists and left-wing progressivism. The moment he hears utopia or optimism, or even political correctness, he's going to roll his eyes. The foundational truth of existence is suffering. Politics cannot save humanity, but laws are still absolutely necessary because deterrence works. Progress, though, is just a childish delusion, and communism is just another religious fantasy. And there's no government that can exist without corruption, because existence itself is corruption. Changing laws or defunding the police will never change human nature. It's almost like rearranging furniture on the Titanic as it sinks. If I had to guess, Schopenhauer today might enjoy countries like Singapore or Japan, although he'd hate the work culture and the nationalism, especially the group conformity. Maybe Italy then, but in our scenario, he's an American. How regrettable. What about cancel culture and the leftist activism? Well, he genuinely believed in compassion, he did, and everyone deserves basic human dignity. But don't expect him to join in any rallies. And most people are only motivated by selfishness, and laws are the main reason people don't act like animals in public. He noted in his time that American slavery was one of the most brutal displays of his time. And he argued that it's difficult for people to change their behavior, and only because they have to. In regards to average people, mediocrity is a direct threat to highly intelligent people. Schopenhauer noted that smart people receive far more abuse from society. Not sure if that's true now, but it was important for him that people understood his genius and that he receive his due diligence. But I wonder if Schopenhauer secretly fantasized a life of fame, whether or not that included his philosophy. I guess it's fair to ask for both. Anyway, if Schopenhauer saw woke leftist culture, I don't think he would necessarily soften his views. I think he would laugh at the protesters and leftist revolutionaries and tell them to give up and go home. He wrote extensively about why humans can't stand being alone, and the 2020s fit his views. It seems he was more correct than Mainlander in this regard. I think Schopenhauer would frown at the modern loneliness epidemic. He wrote, "A man can be himself only so long as he is alone, and if he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom." I suppose that partially answers my contention with boredom earlier, and maybe I don't love freedom after all, who knows? On the other hand, he would still acknowledge the pain loneliness brings. Many people are isolated, rejected, disabled, maybe socially awkward, but he'd still mock people depending on their motivations, of course, perhaps groups like incels for their sexual frustration. I think he'd tell them that their lives are a blessing in disguise and to go read some books or something. Anyway, he'd argue that modern Americans aren't lonely because of the lack of community. Loneliness is born when you're trapped in your own mind and you find your own company intolerable. I think he's half correct here, but ultimately people are social animals. People can hate being around others, especially introverts, but they can still feel lonely all the time. Schopenhauer himself ate in public and cared deeply about receiving recognition. I honestly wonder if 8 billion people vanished and Schopenhauer was left alone on Earth. Would he enjoy this? I think he'd tolerate it. For cancel culture, he'd definitely mock it and call that group of people a bunch of weak-minded, untalented individuals. He'd hate virtue signaling and social media callouts as people posture for moral righteousness. At the bottom of it all, he'd say that most people are a bunch of terminally online bored losers who have nothing to say about their own lives. Maybe. I mean, there is a point to be made that people who brag about things that they have little or no control over, like their skin color, their ancestors, gender, sexuality, you'll notice these people usually don't have many personal accomplishments to talk about. Pride should come from difficult feats in work, especially alone. His views on gays were outdated. This is a bit controversial. He tried to explain same-sex drive as nature's mechanism for weeding out weaker genetics, essentially, which of course is just pseudobiology and not based on empirical evidence. So I think he'd shift his view after catching up on science today. And Schopenhauer would still support homosexuality. At least, he wouldn't care about what consenting adults do in the privacy of their own homes. The only thing he'd be confused about would be pride movements and sexual liberation. As far as creating a personal identity from your orientation, he'd find this absurd. Why celebrate the sex drive when you're supposed to renunciate it? So, in his opinion, wise people should know better than to reproduce. Naturally, this extends to heterosexuals as well. So he'd object to expensive weddings and people who treat parenthood as the end-all be-all to happiness. He'd chastise religious couples who believes it's God's command to reproduce. So gay, queer, straight, whatever, doesn't matter. He'd look at most lovers as sentimental idiots. Now, I couldn't find any information on Schopenhauer's thoughts on abortion. I think he'd support early-term abortion, but he might hesitate on late-term. It's complicated because his metaphysics doesn't really assign will from the moment of birth, and will is eternal, so humans can deny the will and animals really can't. But he'd probably lean towards pro-choice, especially as dogmatic Christian beliefs hold all life is valuable. Religious authority would push him more left here. As for feminism, well, more cracks start to show here. He wrote one of the most infamously misogynistic essays in all of philosophy. He argued that women are intellectually short-sighted, as well as emotional and manipulative, as well as incapable of abstract reasoning. Certain women on social media might confirm his beliefs, at least when he said they will remain children their whole lives. He believed women should always remain submissive. Remember, he's from 19th century Germany, though. So he'd see modern feminism as a joke. Female leaders and influencers would bother him, but he might regard successful women as rare intellects, or that they have more masculine features that don't attract most men. He did write that women are still useful, since they can handle situations differently. And I think he doubled down that giving power to women leads to an irrational society that's driven by emotional gratification and superficiality. But this contradicts his position that compassion should be given equally, and then he generalizes half of humanity. Well, what can you say? You can probably blame his mother for that. And then he'd look at Western hookup culture and sex in general. Looking at OnlyFans and modern relationships would make him feel repulsed. But Schopenhauer would criticize men the hardest. Men who simp for women so easily, for being such weak-willed slaves to their basic nature. He'd accuse women of being too materialistic, but he'd save his worst insults for the average man. But there's an interesting twist here. See, there's a paradox to women's liberation. When they have more freedom, they generally choose to have fewer children, especially with education. So he might laugh and feel a bit of joy as he watched the global population level off. On one hand, he'd mock the reasons why people are having fewer children, mostly selfishness and economy. He'd see these as superficial reasons. But to him, moral value still depends on one's motives. So the result doesn't matter so much if you did something out of selfishness rather than compassion. But at least fewer people is less suffering. Now, I had to think twice about Schopenhauer's take on the collapse of our society and whether he'd accelerate towards extinctionism or something else. Because he might subvert our expectations here. I think Schopenhauer would feel vindicated watching the decline of society, but he wouldn't celebrate the suffering. Then he'd say, well, as you see, back in 1818, I wrote about this. But I'm not sure he would encourage humanity's extinction. Here's why. He asked his readers to imagine the barren moon as a place without suffering compared to Earth. There's less suffering. But according to his philosophy, will is eternal, and the death of humanity wouldn't deny that. And he was against taking your own life already, so as far as everyone following that principle, it would require everyone's consent, and even then this doesn't stop life from re-emerging somewhere else in the universe. In other words, every time consciousness is born, the will smiles and says, wake up, it's time to die again. Oh, but first let's have breakfast. So I do think he'd reject violence, even if it ensured a world without suffering. It's just omnicide. And again, he was against self-annihilation because the will is indestructible. The best solution, in Schopenhauer's mind, was a quiet resignation. Walk your dog, play the flute, whatever. And when you die, that's it. You die forever. It's almost like experience itself is the embodiment, a puppet made to believe it has a self, and wanting is the blind puppet master. Like, the master of the universe is less you than you, yet it has total power. And because your exact experiences will never occur again, you will never have to worry about life again, as far as you're aware anyway, so rest easy. Anyway, the intensity of suffering matters, and he'd consider a lifeless world better than one filled with sentience. And if you could convince Schopenhauer that the universe ends forever at heat death, he'd probably shrug and say, well, bring on the nukes then. But there's some more problems here. Extinction doesn't remove the will, especially outside of our world. It also massively increases suffering before reducing it. Also, wanting to control the fate of all existence is arrogant, as well as an affirmation to the will. And after all of that, you would need to guarantee that. So I think he'd focus on compassion, lowering population slowly, and finding other ways to fight suffering. And he might say that anyone who dresses up life in cute little ornaments and storytelling would be optimistic or delusional. But the counter-argument to this kind of Schopenhauer is that if consciousness is stuck in prison, then why not? Why not dress it up? Because the only thing Schopenhauer imagines is that silence outside the prison must be freedom. As for that topic, I'll have to talk about it more another day. But tell me what you think. Tell me if you think this is what Schopenhauer would say if he were alive today. So, after learning about every world war, every dictator, global conflicts, all the suffering on Earth, and just by looking at America in our current year, perhaps Schopenhauer earns the title of one of the most vindicated thinkers in all of human history. Human beings are inherently malicious animals who keep finding new ways to destroy one another. And his core thesis would remain that human beings are miserable. We're overstimulated animals trapped in a digital prison of our own making. On the other hand, I do believe he'd enjoy modern luxuries as best he can. And in some ways, he'd enjoy it even more. Overall, probably not, though. I'm not sure what Schopenhauer would say if he lived life as the last human on Earth. Like I said earlier, he would tolerate it. For a few days, perhaps. At first, he'd enjoy the silence. Then, when modern convenience became impossible to use in a one-man world, he'd start to hate it. He'd probably endure it better than most people, though. But being understood was deeply important to him. Maybe you find Schopenhauer too bleak. And that's fair. I would call him a realist, but I'm going to read a little bit from Leo Tolstoy, where even the optimists have to pay tribute to him. And yes, it does relate to Schopenhauer. He writes, "My life came to a standstill. I could breathe, eat, drink, and sleep, and I could not help doing these things, but there was no life, for there were no wishes, the fulfillment of which I could consider reasonable. If I desired anything, I knew in advance that whether I satisfied my desire or not, nothing would come of it. Had a fairy come and offered to fulfill my desires, I should not have known what to ask. If in moments of intoxication I felt something which, though not a wish, was a habit left by former wishes, in sober moments I knew this to be a delusion, and that there was really nothing to wish for. I could not even wish to know the truth, for I guessed of what it consisted. The truth was that life is meaningless. I had as it were lived, and walked, till I had come to a precipice and saw clearly that there was nothing ahead of me but destruction. It was impossible to stop, impossible to go back, and impossible to close my eyes, or avoid seeing that there was nothing ahead but suffering and real death, complete annihilation. I've already made a video on Tolstoy, if you're interested, but anyway. He continues here to acknowledge the king of pessimism, and perhaps this is where Peter Zapffe took some inspiration. I found that for people of my circle there were 4 ways out of the terrible position in which we are all placed. The first was that of ignorance. It consists in not knowing, not understanding that life is an evil and an absurdity. People of this sort, chiefly women or very young or very dull people, have not yet understood that question of life which presented itself to Schopenhauer, Solomon, and Buddha. They see neither the dragon that awaits them, nor the mice gnawing the shrub by which they are hanging, and they lick the drops of honey. But they lick those drops of honey only for a while. Something will turn their attention to the dragon and the mice, and there will be an end to their licking. From them, I had nothing to learn. One cannot cease to know what one does know. The second way out is Epicureanism. The fact that some of these people declare the dullness of their thoughts and imaginations to be a philosophy, which they call a positive, does not remove them, in my opinion, from the ranks of those who, to avoid seeing the question, lick the honey. I could not imitate these people. Not having their dullness of imagination, I could not artificially produce it in myself. I could not tear my eyes from the mice and the dragon, as no vital man can after he has once seen them. The third way, having understood that life is evil and stupid, was to end it by killing oneself. I understood that, but somehow still did not kill myself. The fourth way was to live like Solomon and Schopenhauer, knowing that life is a stupid joke played upon us, and still to go on living, washing oneself, dressing, dining, talking, and even writing books. This to me was repulsive and tormenting, but I remained in that position. So this was a really powerful admission to read, and I'm not sure how Tolstoy would tolerate modern existence. And I'm not sure I want to know, but I look around and there's a bit of Tolstoy in all of us these days. To be honest, I'm glad time machines don't exist, because if it did, that means someone would be stupid enough to bring Schopenhauer to watch the world after his death, or anyone else actually. And would they deserve that? But I think after examining it for about 10 minutes, he'd die on the spot anyway. Which, in a way, should make us somewhat proud. Proud that we're far stronger than we realize, and I'm not just blowing smoke up your ass. Well, I sort of am, but I think he'd be proud of some of us today, because he wouldn't be able to tolerate it. But we also shouldn't celebrate the fact that we're somehow surviving a broken world. When you think about it, there's nothing to brag about. There's no reward for us, and in a sense, many of you are a time-traveled version of Schopenhauer. You've come to similar conclusions, and you've seen the same old bullshit story for the last 200 years. And I think to myself from time to time, is it worse than even he predicted? Who knows? But there may be one other figure that remains just as vindicated as Schopenhauer in his vision of the world. Julius Bonson. But we'll have to talk about him another day. Soon, I promise. I had to finish translating some of his work, but I'm getting close to the end. Anyway, that's enough for today. This was more of a fun video, at least to write out and play with different hypotheticals. And don't take it too seriously. Go take your dog for a walk or something. I'll see you all in the next video. Peace.